for 15 years. It's a possible internet fragmentation. He prepared a presentation, a paper, which I shared with you about a month ago. So, and then we're going to have the coffee. Please don't leave yet. I know we started late because you were delayed. So, Adrian, please call Bill Drake. I know he's sitting outside.
Sí, ya sé que está allá. Así que el tema
was very important before the Summit of Information 2005, and it still it remains a fragmented internet would not be the internet that we know today, and it wouldn't be as global and useful as it is today.
a la ley.
Please be quiet on this side of the room, please. They're not even looking at me. They're focused on something else completely. Yeah, today's Friday. The Friday effect seems to be international. It's not only in Argentina, apparently.
Sí, claro. You have slides?
Yeah, they have slides.
Okay. Bienvenido, welcome again. From here?
Yeah, it's fine. Oh, you even brought me one.
Sure. Mr. Drake is the clicker for the presentation.
So, let's see, where are we? What am I pointing at? Hola. It is on, and I see myself. That's something, but it's not what I want. Slideshow, please. Is anybody working on the slides? Yes. Aha! All right. Well, hello again. This is my third time this week before you, so I'm pleased to be here. This has been, since it's April Fool's Day, it's a nice day to talk about cybersecurity and dark webs and threats and all that stuff. And in keeping with that happy tone, I will now talk about internet fragmentation. And I believe you had shared with them the paper that I wrote with Vince Cerf and Wolfgang Kleinvector on this for the World Economic Forum that we released in Davos earlier this year. And essentially what I'm going to do is talk off that paper, which is, I understand, fairly long and covers a lot of ground, but nevertheless, I think provides a template for thinking about this general problem. And the slides you'll see, the text I'm going to just talk through real quickly, is actually all drawn directly from the paper itself. So if you've got the paper, you're good to go. That's the real version of what's worth paying attention to. Oh, you know what? This is fascinating. I can't read that from here. So, all right, then I might have to do. Oh, I could do it this way. I could do it this way. Is this rude? I have my back to everybody then? No. So, no, I have it on here too, so I can just I'll do double duty here and flip on my own on my own screen, and then voila. A few seconds of logistical work here to be done, but then we'll be fine. Okay. Come on. So advanced. So, internet fragmentation. There have been long-standing concerns in many circles about the growth of internet fragmentation and trends that have given rise to these concerns, particularly with regard to the technical infrastructure that have been noted by many internet engineers over the years. What has changed recently, though, is that in the past few years you've had a sort of politicization at the global level of the question due to a number of different factors. One was, first of all, the World Conference on International Telecommunications negotiations in 2012, in which you had a deeply divided international community coming together to revise the international telecommunications regulations. And one of the big issues was whether or not these should apply in some measures to the internet space. And this ended up resulting in, I believe it was 59 countries from the industrialized world and others refusing to sign the treaty, and 70, so I'm forgetting the numbers now, signing. But so you had then, after that meeting, a real split in the perceptions on the part of a lot of different governments and other stakeholders about the proper role of governments and role of multilateral institutions with regard to the internet and its governance. And this gave rise to a lot of overheated discussion for a while of a so-called digital Cold War between different parties. And then coming right after that was the Snowden revelations. And when that came and everybody began to see that mass surveillance was widely being practiced, first by the US, but then it became understood by other governments as well. This increasingly incented a lot of governments to begin to say, we have to look at the way we interface with the global space, how our territory, our territorial jurisdiction interacts with the global transnational realm of the internet, and to think about how they might want to define or redefine that relationship. And many began to adopt policies, such as data localization policies, that in effect restricted the use of the internet and the expansion of the cyberspaces facilitated by the infrastructure in important ways, and in ways that affected a lot of different actors, both in the private sector and non-commercial actors as well. So in that context then, we began to have a more sort of increasingly ideological kind of orientation coming in, where some governments, particularly China, Russia, Iran, and some others, began to advance notions that they had to preserve their so-called cyber sovereignty over their particular territorial extension of the internet. The Russians began to speak of national information spaces, national internet segments, as a sort of distinct thing, somehow separate from the transnational global internet. So in this context then, with all these things being ramped up, a lot of thought leaders in different realms, in different environments, began to express concerns about, oh my God, fragmentation of the internet is really deepening. These included people like Vint Cerf, but also the current and former presidents, well, Fadi Chahadi, the just retired president of ICANN, and two of his predecessors, various business leaders and so on, we're all starting to talk about fragmentation of the internet as an alarming new trend, and one that we had to somehow stop or at least rein in. And this, of course, made me think, well, they have legitimate concerns there, but they're looking at a part of the problem. In a way, because there are other aspects of fragmentation that impact other actors differently. So we need to think about this in a little bit more organized manner. So I want to make clear at the outset, in talking about fragmentation, I'm not suggesting in any way, and we say this on page 1 of the paper, that, you know, oh my God, the internet is about to collapse or break down, or it's fundamentally being transformed in a horrible way or something like that. But what we think is happening is that there's a progressive sort of growing compartmentalization, segmentation, erection of boundaries and barriers in a variety of different spaces of the internet, which are potentially can chip away at the value of the internet to everybody as a whole, and in consequence is something that we have to pay attention to and think about in a coherent way. People were talking about this emerging trend, we use in terms like balkanization or Westphalian web, Westphalia being the place where they had the big negotiation in 1648 that is typically regarded as having given rise to the modern nation-state system, or censornet or splinternet, so on, often emphasizing just the interstate vertical geographic segmentation by government action of the transnational horizontal space. But there are other views on what fragmentation means as well. Many business people were starting to talk about fragmentation in a way that basically implied that anything that was raising their costs of their operations to their global value chains and causing friction in their operations was somehow fragmentary. And then you had people who, in civil society and elsewhere, who were critics of some of the practices of those same companies, pointing to things like the growth of walled gardens or non-network neutrality oriented approaches, and saying that these were fragmentary. So you had lots of different actors saying there's fragmentation, but citing different kinds of developments. And the technical people, of course, with their own criteria. So my point here is to say none of these individual cases being cited by different actors can by itself entail the full realm of what we mean by fragmentation. And that's why when the World Economic Forum asked me, after a meeting we had had about this in Davos in 2015, to undertake a study that would do a landscaping assessment of the range of fragmentation instances across the environment, I said sure, and I talked Vint and Wolfgang into joining this because I thought it was very important to try to have a broad, holistic view of fragmentation that takes into account the narrow, bounded conception of fragmentation that engineers historically would ascribe to, which has to do with basically the technical functionality of the net, but also look at forms of fragmentation in the cyberspaces created on top of that infrastructure that are of concern to other players in the private sector, civil society, and so on. So we wanted to take a broad, holistic view. And this is in a lot of ways parallel to the discussion that we had a decade ago about internet governance. There was, at the time, many people during the World Summit on the Information Society who thought of internet governance in a very narrow way as just meaning the management of names and numbers and root servers at the global level. And there were those of us who argued, no, we need a broad, holistic approach to internet governance, one that recognizes that rules pertaining to the use of the internet for information, communication, and commerce also constitute forms of governance. This is sort of the same kind of issue then. To take a broad view is to say, not all things are the same. There are different kinds of categories of fragmentation, but they still have some shared property of being fragmentation, and so they should be talked about in a coherent way. And then from there, we can begin to drill down into the differences. Now, when you talk about fragmentation, what's the baseline against which you measure? And we took as our starting point the original architectural vision of the internet that Vint and others had when they were designing it in the days when the internet was really for academic information sharing and process sharing, etc., which of course was a very different world back then, which was that every device should be able to communicate and exchange data packets with any other device that was willing to receive them. So everybody has the ability to reach everybody who wants to be received, and that you would have consistent interoperability on an end-to-end basis, irrespective of the location of the users at the endpoints, the ICT that they were using, the service providers that they had, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, irrespective of whether you're You're living in a country with a monopoly provider of telecommunications and internet service provisioning, or you're on an Apple, you're on a Mac, it doesn't matter. Everybody should be able to be reached and exchange packets if they wish to be. And of course, if they don't wish to be, if they wish to protect themselves through firewalls and other kinds of mechanisms, then this is entirely fine. And that's a kind of a good fragmentation, you might say. So the notion then of having a globally interoperable end-to-end internet where everybody who wants to communicate could, where you have global reach with integrity and a unified global and properly governed root and naming and numbering system, universal accessibility, and importantly the reusability of capabilities for permissionless innovation so that people could draw on common resources to create new services and applications like a Skype or like a Google or whatever, all these things that grew up in the past decades because of the open nature of the internet. These are the things that really define the internet fundamentally, and deviations from those as that idealized starting point of this kind of an open internet can be viewed as, whether it via blocking or other kinds of measures, can be viewed as leading to some measure of fragmentation. And so that's how we went about thinking about it. So that's a fairly open, admittedly, a baseline to start from. Now, of course, historically, when we talk about the internet, we talk about the TCP IP protocol stack and the 4 layers of it. You're all very familiar with that. For the purpose of this kind of analysis, if we wanted to take into account the uses of the internet to create cyberspaces and engage in transactions, etc., we said it's useful, as many analysts do, to add a kind of 5th nominal layer on top of all of these, the physical network, transport, and application layers. We added the layer that we called content and transactions layer. This is the realm in which people actually use the net to create, disseminate, access information, and are subject to various types of institutional constraints. This kind of 5th layer notion is sort of where a lot of the activity that many people now cite as being fragmentary is actually taking place. Now, from an engineering standpoint, you might look at those and say, well, but they don't limit the underlying ability of the internet to function, so they're not the same kind of fragmentation that I, as an engineer, would be concerned about. They're different. And we said that's fine. There's no single form of fragmentation, and so we wanted to acknowledge that by making some distinctions. So one was to distinguish between fragmentation that occurs of the internet, of the underlying infrastructure, the physical fragmentation, and fragmentation on the internet. I mean, this is terrible language actually, but basically on the internet, meaning what goes on at the 5th layer of content and transactions. It's a simple binary to help people understand an issue. It breaks down in a lot of important ways. So we were saying, let's look at the 2 of these levels and talk about how fragmentation plays out in different parts of the internet space. So we offered 3 working definitions that are relevant to our assessment. Technical fragmentation, meaning conditions in the underlying infrastructure that impede the ability of systems to fully interoperate and exchange data packets, and of the internet to function consistently at all endpoints. These are, as I say, pertain mostly to layers 1 to 4. And then governmental and commercial fragmentation, because these are really driven not so much by a desire by governments to affect the underlying infrastructure so much and make the internet less useful, but they're concerned about how it's being used, how the internet's being used, and they're trying to impose rules and conditions that affect that. So here we talk about government policies or corporate business practices that constrain or prevent certain uses of the internet to create, distribute, or access information resources. And again, these are generally at the 5th level. So here we're talking about blocking, we're talking about limiting the ability, the freedom of users to do whatever they want to do. Last kind of conceptual point, and I know I'm starting with a conceptual bit before we get to the examples, but this is necessary to lay the groundwork. is to recognize that fragmentation, as I've described it here, is a highly variable phenomena. Fragmentation takes many forms and many flavors, which means sometimes people will say, well, to call all those things fragmentation doesn't make sense because, you know, they're really quite different in some important respects. But there's also a level at which, of abstraction at which they have common properties of imposing segmentation, limitations, etc. in the internet, and so it's useful to have an umbrella concept and then look what's under it. So we talk about fragmentation, but we recognize that in any given case, you have to ask yourself a number of important questions. First of all, is fragmentation really occurring? And here it's not always just a binary yes or no type of question. Fragmentation can be matters of degree, matters of shades of gray. But whether a type of fragmentation exists or is just a potential, a lot of the discussion about fragmentation is worrying about what might happen if. It's forward-looking. It's not necessarily current. Intentionality, whether fragmentation is the result of the deliberate action of actors seeking to impose restrictions and limitations, or is an unintended consequence of actions taken for other reasons. A lot of technical fragmentation, I would argue, is of the latter kind. Impact, and this is probably the most important, whether the fragmentation you're talking about is deep, structural, and configurative of large parts of activity, large scope of activity for many internet users, the internet as a whole, or rather more shallow, malleable, and applicable to a narrowly bounded set of processes, transactions, or actors. So, for example, if you were to have a split internet root where somebody created an entire different root zone file system, built up all the institutions and processes around that so that you had essentially two parallel and separate internets running. This would be, a significant, deep, structural, configurative kind of fragmentation. Some barriers to ability to access the internet that some people encounter in particular countries about particular kinds of information and so on, that may be a short-term thing, it may only impact a certain number of actors and certain types of substantive contents, etc. That's a much narrower phenomena. It may also be a transitory phenomena. It might be that there's fragmentation for a short period of time, or a longer period of time, or permanently. So we have to recognize we're talking about a lot of different things here. And then finally, the character of fragmentation. Is it fundamentally good and positive? And there are cases that indeed are. There are good reasons to take actions that may fragment the internet in some ways, such as the construction of firewalls and other techniques to preserve security and keep out unwanted packets and processes, etc. Or fragmentation that is negative, that has a negative cost, raises the costs and limits the freedom of users of the internet. So, against all that background, let me just briefly then highlight a few examples. And I won't go through all this in detail because I want to open up the conversation in 15 minutes or so. But just I don't know how many of you have actually had a chance to look at the paper because all these issues are dealt with in more detail there. But let me just highlight a few examples from each of the three kinds of fragmentation that we identify: technical, commercial, and governmental. And then we'll open it up for conversation. So for technical fragmentation, here, again, this is the traditional narrow view of fragmentation as an engineering issue arising in the four layers of the IP stack. And much of this fragmentation, as I indicated, is a complex evolutionary process that's unfolded slowly over many years, but is arguably gathering steam today. It's the aggregation of a lot of individual localized decisions, which may or may not be made with the objective in mind of limiting the functionality of the internet. In many cases, they are not. But there are other cases where somebody may choose to fragment, choose to actually impose restrictions and limitations for various reasons. So, some examples. Addressing. Network address translation, where an organization essentially shares IP address among a number of different players rather than having individual IP addresses for all the different devices, etc., is from the standpoint of engineers in ways that I'm a political scientist, I'm not an engineer, but engineering friends tell me this is really not a good thing for the internet, and it's very widespread. Okay. It's the kind of thing that you can work around probably, but it raises costs. It makes things more difficult. It's a challenge for people who have to design routing and everything else. IPv4 and IPv6. The lack of compatibility between these two models and the necessity of running dual stack approaches where you're running both IP4 and 6 is challenging and demanding, and there's some risk in the view of technical people that I talk to of increasing bifurcation if more and more deployment continues or if deployment continues to lag in IPv6, yet the demand for IPv6 increases greatly by virtue of the spread of the Internet of Things and so on and so forth. You could have scenarios where there is incomplete ability for all these different objects and processes to interwork effectively. Interconnection, the spread of firewalls, etc. Again, a positive form of fragmentation. Routing, there's the possibilities, and we talk about these things again in the paper in more detail, of deliberate or accidental corruption of routing data that essentially breaks connections and makes it difficult for you to be able to communicate effectively. Virtual private networks and things like the Onion router or Tor. We just talked about these. I generally would regard these as good forms of fragmentation. They enable people to do things that otherwise they might be limited from doing. At the same time, people being people, it's not the internet's fault. People being people, a lot of people use these things for bad things. And because people use them for bad things as well as good things, then governments seek to, in many cases, restrict them, which in itself also imposes restrictions and fragmentation at a certain level. The domain name system. The growth of internationalized domain names. Some people talk about the growth of IDNs as inherently fragmentary because of the spread of all these different character sets and languages. I myself don't think of it that way. I think it just means the world is diverse and lots of people speak lots of languages. That's not a bad thing, and that's not a fragmentary thing. There's a difference between differentiation and difference and fragmentation. But where fragmentation could come in, I think, is if from a technical standpoint, the names are not uniformly processed across the internet. That's to say, there's some concern among some technical people I've talked to that because of the growth of the IDN space, that you could have technical errors in the recognition and ability of all these different names and the ability to translate effectively and maintain connectivity among all the different players. New GTLDs, about which you heard quite a bit yesterday. Many people talk about the potential for customer confusion and experiential fragmentation, that people don't know where anything is anymore. Which is the legitimate website for my bank? Is it the one that's in .org or the one that's in .bank, or is it the one that's in Yahoo or whatever? These questions, of course, grow substantially. I wouldn't call that a kind of a structural fragmentation, but experientially, there's certainly some problem there that has to be dealt with. But the more profound issue from my standpoint around new GTLDs is the possibility of the spread of blocking at the GTLD level. There are governments who don't like some of the new GTLDs. Indeed, there are governments who have already said, when ICANN adopted .XXX for pornography back in 2011, that they were going to block it. And I don't know, I have not seen recent numbers. These are not always easy to find. Is the possibility of the spread of blocking at the GTLD level. There are governments who don't like some of the new GTLDs. Indeed, there are governments who have already said when ICANN adopted .XXX for pornography back in 2011 that they were going to block it. And I don't know, I have not seen recent numbers. These are not always easy to find, but at the time there were about 50 governments that indicated they were going to block XXX. Now, if you start to spread the range of GTLDs that have semantic meaning that somebody doesn't like, whether it's .human rights, .gay, .bible, whatever, and governments begin to just say, well, we're just going to block that. Then you start to add a layer of fragmentation into the management of the top-level domain namespace. The split horizon DNS, the problem of running the different systems, again, an example of this. Alternate domain routes, the possibility, we haven't seen the reality of it, but the possibility that what used to be sort of just an experimental thing that some engineers did to try to play with network science and innovation in developing alternative approaches to management of internet resources could, in the context of an intergovernmental kind of initiative, become a vehicle for actually creating fundamentally separate internets. Now, of course, optimists say, well, of course.
Claro, siempre se encuentra forma como verlos, y con el tiempo quizás algunos serán ciertos, pero si uno empieza a tener países que dicen queremos más control soberano de lo que nuestros clientes o ciudadanos pueden accesar, pues qué tipo de información puede cruzar fronteras. Si pensamos que el tener un sistema separado de nombre de dominio, separado del INI, que puede ser para interés nuestro, entonces uno puede tener una fragmentación seria. Hay otros ejemplos de la seguridad técnica, los certificados que se emiten. Últimamente hubo un caso de la China y Google sobre los certificados de seguridad que no eran adecuados y llevó a interrupciones en la interoperabilidad. Rápidamente voy a decir algo. Estos serán ejemplos de fragmentación técnica. Y espero que no esté hablando demasiado rápido, pero si ustedes han visto el documento, me podrán seguir. Y si no han leído el documento, entonces están fuera de onda. Bueno, la fragmentación comercial que se llevaron a cabo por miembros del sector privado, las empresas comerciales, pero también otras compañías de tecnología y negocios que pueden poner barreras, restricciones, etcétera, y pueden crear fragmentación en el ciberespacio con el límite de usuarios y que pueden utilizar libremente a nivel global. Hay muchos ejemplos que uno puede citar. Una de las cosas que todos conocemos, telecom, compañías de cable y otras de infraestructura pueden tener incentivos para discriminar entre las aplicaciones y los servicios. Este es el caso, por ejemplo, con la neutralidad de redes. Pero hay otros ejemplos, solo para citar algunos. La estandarización y pares. Hay algunas compañías que han cambiado su organización económica de la Internet para ser como la telefónica. Y esto puede dividir la Internet en organizaciones comerciales, y esto ocurrió, pero puede volver. Hay una inquietud creciente de la parte de Telecom y otros operadores de los servicios por encima que llaman, por lo cual creen que deben ser pagados cada vez que hay una transacción. Y hay algunas normas de propiedad técnica que se están adoptando. Y este sería un problema, sobre todo en el campo de la Internet de las cosas, donde hay tantos tipos de neveras o cosas que tienen que hablar entre sí. Y ojalá no atacarnos. Y este es un tema candente ahora. Luego, las partidas, al alejarse de la neutralidad de las redes, voiceovers y del ISP y otros operadores, limitando la habilidad de algunos proveedores de contenido alcanzar a todos los clientes o los clientes o los proveedores, así que quizás han empezado algunos contratos separados. Esto de transacciones puede acelerar o disminuir la velocidad o puede llegar a espacios separados donde se aplican varias cosas. Y los jardines encerrados, todos tenemos estos. Mi computadora está llena de estos jardines encerrados. Vivimos en un mundo donde esto no es una cosa nueva. Siempre los hemos tenido plataformas cerradas y propietarias y tenían sus propios sistemas como CompuServe y America Online y todo esto. Pero esto es una botella muy amplia en la economía y todos tenemos nuestros propios artefactos de estos jardines encerrados donde hay distintas empresas que hacen que sean soberanos en comportamiento. Algunos usan cosas como Bookistan, Facebookistan, que uno vive en el país digital de alguna empresa y aceptan los términos y condiciones que especifican. Y en muchos casos, muchas veces ofrecen muchos beneficios de alta calidad de servicios y quizás protección de viruses y contra viruses y buena estabilidad, seguridad. Pero viene con un costo el estar encerrados con estas aplicaciones y no tener la posibilidad de llevar su identidad digital, su persona y llevarla a otra plataforma. No tienen esa habilidad. Entonces son jardines encerrados que tienen no muchas puertas, pero altas verjas y no permiten a que la gente fuera del internet llegue a usted. Pero gente no puede buscar en un sitio web y buscar o dentro de su ambiente de Facebook o otros ambientes. Está aislado del resto de la red. El zero rating es otra cosa que es considerado actividad fragmentaria en un jardín encerrado porque dice que el acceso libre a ciertos sitios y aplicaciones y servicios y a distintas maneras de tener el acceso de zero rating, que es un tema muy grande. Y que no lo vamos a mencionar ahora, la geolocalización o geobloqueo. No sé cuántos de ustedes lo reciben. Yo vivo en Europa y soy de Estados Unidos y muchas veces quiero ver la televisión de Estados Unidos y voy a la web y me dicen no pueden ver esto en su jurisdicción, no pueden comprar esto en su jurisdicción porque hay acuerdos de licencias que los proveedores han hecho con distribuidores locales, etcétera, y entonces lo están juzgando sobre la ubicación de su dirección de IP. Y si usted es inteligente y tiene una red virtual distinta, pues, pero no todos los usuarios tienen ese conocimiento de cómo hacerlo, o no quieren pagar, o no les gusta la solución. Entonces, aquí le tienen acceso a contenido que está siendo partido y encerrado según su ubicación física. Y este es un problema que aún la Comisión Europea ahora está estudiando como una manera de práctica discriminatoria que quizás quieran decir algo al respecto. Último comentario sobre la propiedad intelectual. El sector privado ha trabajado duro para que los gobiernos adopten reglas para proteger la propiedad intelectual para muchos mecanismos y se puede hablar mucho de la virtud de todos estos, pero quiero decir que algunas propuestas hechas últimamente, quizás conozcan propuestas que vinieron del Congreso hace unos años donde se propusieron leyes y se haya podido proteger la propiedad intelectual, y pueden que hayan tenido servidores de dominio que eviten que ciertos nombres resuelvan correctamente las direcciones de IP, porque se creía que estaban infringiendo los sitios web y los buscadores eran para quitar o deshabilitar los vínculos. Esto es una fragmentación de espacios en la Internet, y utilizar la arquitectura básica de la Internet para poder servir propósitos para los cuales no había sido diseñado. Para algunos de nosotros esto no es como se debe resolver problemas. Puede que haber inquietudes, pero no deben ser resueltos de esa forma. Voy a terminar rápidamente sobre la parte gubernamental, que de seguro ustedes conocen. Generalmente uno está hablando acá de cosas que ocurren en un quinto nivel de contenido y transacciones, y aunque a veces para poder llegar ahí uno tiene que hacer cosas a niveles más bajos, que no puede ser bueno para la Internet en sí. El objetivo es de evitar que hay usuarios de cierto tipo de acceso y uso de recursos de información. Entonces, muchas veces es específico y está enfocado y limitado en su duración, pero a veces también es más amplio, de larga duración y continuo, ese tipo de problemas. Se pueden citar varios ejemplos, varios tipos de censura y bloqueo, de controles de primera generación, filtros, y incluir instrucciones en puntos de choque, y bloquear continuamente ciertos servidores, y segunda generación, leyes, reglamentos que establecen todo tipo de notas y piden, hay intersecciones y prevención de ciertas distribución y negación de servicios, quitar licencias, y medidas técnicas como las desconexiones, interrupciones, y el contratar a hackers para fines negativos, y todo esto lo hemos visto y todos lo sabemos. Comercio electrónico está creciendo el proteccionismo digital, donde en ciertos mercados era que antes, con los acuerdos de la Organización Mundial de Comercio y otros órganos comerciales y los flujos de comercio, y estaban libremente en las redes, pero ahora más y más los gobiernos tratan de restringir las cosas que no, a diferencia de otros mercados históricamente, para protecciones de datos, y que afecta a la industria, y proteger su propia marca y tratar de conseguir un mejor negocio con la empresa con la que trata, este tipo de cosas. Pero todo esto termina bloqueando a los usuarios y su acceso y el uso de plataformas claves y herramientas, ya sea para transacciones comerciales. Y no solo está afectando a los grandes negocios, sino también las empresas más pequeñas y medianas, y los usuarios individuales también. La sociedad tiene también un lenguaje muy interesante, porque trata de fijar normas estándares, donde dicen que si uno va a imponer restricciones como limitaciones del flujo de datos o nuevas políticas de localización de datos, no deben aplicarse de una manera que serían arbitrarias o discriminatorias, y que no deben ser más restrictivas en la transferencia de información que es necesaria para lograr algún propósito legítimo. Se transmite exactamente lo que eso significa, y quisiera tener una discusión de interesados en lugar de dejarlo en manos de abogados. Este tipo de protección digital está ocurriendo, y los gobiernos van a empezar a tratar con ellos con alguna especie de acuerdos especiales o de comercio. La seguridad nacional, dejo eso para ustedes que están en seguridad. Hemos visto muchos esfuerzos para establecer leyes defensivas y de distintos tamaños dentro de los propios territorios, para que protege, según dicen los gobiernos, la jurisdicción de interferencia externa, etcétera. Y esto a veces viene en paralelo por la demanda de instrumentos internacionales que normalizarían y legitimizarían los enfoques restrictivos, y a veces ciertos tipos de restricciones por fines de seguridad nacional son muy aceptables, pero hay algunos que usan la seguridad nacional como un motivo para hacer otras cosas que siempre habían querido hacer, o buscar otros fines que quizás no sean tan defensibles, y ese es un desafío. La protección internacional es un término muy amplio. También la protección de datos es un tema muy álgido. Obviamente, cuando uno ve Europa y Estados Unidos y la lucha de Safe Harbor, se está tratando con distintos sistemas de valores legales, etcétera. Yo no quisiera ver esto como una cosa que es solo de proteccionismo comercial o fragmentación, pero sí quisiera decir que hay países que están tomando nota de esta privacidad, algunos países que generalmente no hablan de la protección para sus ciudadanos, que están imponiendo restricciones en el flujo de datos y dicen más bien que es para proteger la piratería, pero igual que la seguridad nacional, esta protección es legítimamente social, pero es algo que puede ser abusado por los gobiernos que tienen otras agendas en mente. Y por último, las últimas dos, la localización de los datos. Estoy seguro que usted conoce de la localización de datos. En los últimos años, varios gobiernos están adoptando políticas que requieren que los datos se procesen por entidades que están localmente dentro de sus jurisdicciones, en lugar de las nubes o fuera de otro país, o que esté almacenado localmente y no pueden moverlo a otro lado. Y aún hablar o hacer la construcción de arquitecturas locales para que los datos sigan un camino local en lugar que globalmente. Hay políticas discriminatorias para desalentar o hacer imposible que ciertas entidades puedan estar involucradas según de dónde vienen, restricciones sobre movimiento de transfronteras con ciertos datos con consentimiento previo o bloqueadas. Eso es serio. Si los gobiernos bloquean el flujo de datos para empresas que las necesitan para sus transacciones comerciales, esto afectaría a muchos usuarios en este caso. Entonces hay mucha variabilidad y la mezcla precisa depende de cómo pueden ser consideradas fragmentaria. Pero la localización de datos es un fenómeno creciente, y en su visión fundamental, la noción de que los datos deben ser locales es en realidad lo contrario de la Internet, donde históricamente los datos se han movido abiertamente a nivel global. Cuando la gente diseña redes, no piensan dónde estaban las cosas físicamente, y ahora esta es una territorialización de ese espacio. Y parecido a eso, y para incluir la soberanía cibernética, y con esto voy a terminar, estamos viendo mucho últimamente sobre gobiernos muy poderosos para establecer la noción, sobre todo China y Rusia, para establecer la noción de que la Internet debe ser la primera instancia sujeto a controles nacionales, y que el espacio nacional es un espacio herméticamente cerrado, donde los gobiernos pueden definir las fronteras y los interfaces con el mundo externo por medio de una variedad de políticas y mecanismos, y tener un control soberano y completo. Y hemos escuchado de esto en varios contextos, tantos como a nivel internacional. Pero entonces, en conclusión, lo que tratamos de hacer en este documento es darles algo que pensar. Empezaremos diciendo, bueno, por lo menos desarrollaremos un entendimiento total de lo que está pasando con fragmentación, y tomar nota de las variaciones en las distintas categorías. O sea, no tratar comer naranjas y manzanas como si todos fueran manzanas, porque hay fragmentación, y no trate a todo como frutas cuando no son frutas. Hay veces que no hay fragmentaciones que son iguales, pero lo que sí rompe la Internet en cuanto al espacio creado y la habilidad de que gente pueda hacer cosas y usar la Internet eficazmente, y la habilidad de que la Internet resuelva cosas, esto yo creo que son fragmentación legítima. Bueno, lo que debe ocurrir ahora es pasar de este alto nivel a crear tipologías e identificar casos de mala fragmentación que meritan mayor análisis, de desarrollar metodología para evaluar los riesgos, costos, beneficios, y si la fragmentación ha causado mucho daño en algún caso, y cómo hacer que los gobiernos y otros actores aborden este tema y llevar a cabo diálogos de los interesados para concientizar y fijar condiciones que pueden evolucionar hacia soluciones compartidas de estos casos de fragmentación que son problemáticas. Todo el punto de este ejercicio es de tratar de empezar un proceso de crear concientización e institucionalizar esta concientización de que la fragmentación es un fenómeno que uno debe observar y no dejarle que se escape de las manos. Y esto es lo que tratamos de hacer con este documento, y es un tema que va a atraer mucha atención.
It's longer than I want to, but this happens. We cover a lot of ground. So I stop and conclude, and I take any questions. Thank you.
Yo creo que
I believe that Bill's paper has great value because it has a collection that is exhaustive and from a high level, academic high level, of all the possible fragmentations that the current internet can offer related to governments, industry, and intellectual property. We are outside of our schedules. I don't even want to look at my watch, but we have some questions for Bill before we go to the next panel. We have someone from Cuba. Do we have any?
do we have something from remote? No? Okay. Cuba?
I don't remember your name. Good morning. My name is Regina. We have some technical issues here. My question is, did I understand correctly if China, Russia, and Iran tried to have their own enclosed internet? I ask because in Cuba there's a variant called intranet that is not until recently where the citizens have the possibility of connecting to internet. This has been the link with the Cubans with knowledge saved in the web and filtered, or even more filtered than that which we have now, which is internet with several pages to which we do not have access. But intranet is so active, and it remains being a tool of a lot of use because it's cheaper. Thank you.
Yes, I would say that the very notion of a national intranet as opposed to being part of a global internet is a fragmentary notion. We simply didn't mention Cuba very much because one's hopeful that change comes. But there are, and it's not the only case, there are other governments too. I mean, the Iranians are building the halal network or whatever it's called, right? I mean, there are governments who, the North Korean has a kind of intranet. There are governments who think that they are in a position to decide what their citizens should have access to on a fairly comprehensive basis, and have constructed their network architectures accordingly. And that's a long-standing thing. The question is whether we're going to see that spread to varying degrees in places where it has not been a problem so far. And that's, I think, when we talk about these big countries, that it's a forward-looking concern. But there's a lot of concern now. I mean, I don't know if you saw, and again, I'm not just to belabor one example, but just last week the Chinese adopted a new domain name law, which I've been trying to read about it, and I'm finding a lot of conflicting information because it's mostly from English language sources. But it seems that the law says that all content consumed in China must come from servers located in China, which would suggest that a lot of other things that people access in China are now illegal. So I'm meeting with the Chinese on Monday, so I hope to learn a lot more. But anyway, there are a lot of trends like this that are of concern and worth watching.
Próxima.
Next question. We'll hear two more, and then we will have a very, very brief coffee hour.
My question in English. I agree with Olga. I think this is a very helpful paper because it specifies the different types of fragmentation. And one that I'm really concerned about, that I think is really important that we all think about, is the use of internet technologies, as you said, to kind of as weapons for specific goals. I don't know if you were here on Monday, but there was a State Department representative who used the phrase, Google is not law enforcement. But of course, when we think about using search engines or DNS to achieve goals like the ones pursued with SOPA and PIPA, we can see that it does become law enforcement. So these are things that are very easily thrown around by, state representatives, while at the same time they're doing this. So on the one hand, it's important to be clear and understand that, yes, but on the other one, to think about mechanisms that we have to avoid governments doing this, because this is basically control of the internet through intermediaries. The question I ask you is, what mechanisms can we look for to not let these internet technologies be used like that so easily? And of course, I ask because I don't think that's where your paper concludes, but this is the next step that I guess you've been talking to a lot of people about. So
Yes,
can we take the two questions and then you answer? Is that a problem?
Are we don't have an hour?
No, but we started late. Yeah.
Hi, William. It's Carrie. Right here. It'll be in English. Given that you've looked at the landscape across the board, do you think there will be a time where, because each of the fragmentations are happening separately, and there's no dialogue among the different players at either the international level or the national level, do you think there will be a time when the internet will actually stop? Just wondering, in terms of operability, we know based on how the IANA is managed, it will continue, but do you think there'll be a point where we'll actually come to a head where we have to stop and start over?
One more.
Buenos días.
Good morning, Marta Fonseca from Costa Rica. This exhaustive detail of internet fragmentation that is unavoidable in a majority of cases, for instance, as alternative domains by Russians, Chinese, Arabs. I'd like to know, in your opinion, what kind of fragmentation harms internet, or do they not do so definitely?
Exhaustive or exhausting? It's a joke. Anyway, which kinds are harmful and which kinds are not is we just reviewed 28 cases and kind of put them out there, and it wasn't like we even started out going, hey, let's have 28. It was just sort of like we went through the intellectual exercise of listing the things we could think of, and that's what we came to. One could, as a next step, do a typology, and if you look at the back end of the paper, I kind of did this for the top 10 and said, which are kind of bad examples of fragmentation that have raised significant concerns now and should be watched carefully. So you could do a differentiation that sort of like put things into different baskets, good, bad, relatively indifferent, etc. That would be the next phase of the work. The paper was already long enough that we didn't want to try and do it here. But certainly there are forms of fragmentation, as I say, that are either good or at least not particularly harmful. And some of these are indeed measures designed to ensure the integrity and security of systems, the protection of individuals and institutions from external threats, etc. But the question is, this has to be done right in a way that's not overly restrictive of information flow, that is not, as I said about the Trans-Pacific Partnership language, not more restrictive than is needed in order to achieve the legitimate objective. So I think that this is an important question, and it's why we start this conversation, really. The second question was, will the internet stop? No, I don't think so. Again, we're not saying the internet's going to crash. We're saying there's stuff going on out there which is building up friction, that is reducing the value, reducing the ease of internet usage, and which cumulatively begins to impose some greater concerns that may have broader systemic effects. And so we need dialogue to keep track of that, be watchful of it, and make sure that whatever levels of fragmentation are occurring, we are all cognizant of it, and when there are problematic issues, we are able to begin to undertake some sort of dialogue about taking remedial action. Which leads back to the first point, which was about, essentially what I would call the weaponization of the internet and how you deal with that. And it is a real problem. I mean, even like the National Security Agency, if you look at some of the documents Snowden released, they talk about weaponizing the internet. They talk about the internet like it's a weapon that you can point it at an object and shoot, and there are efforts to weaponize the internet from a lot of different angles, from terrorists, from states, from corporations that want to take the domain name system and make it the place where you impose intellectual property rules, et cetera, et cetera. In ICANN, we have constantly pressures from intellectual property interests, for example, to impose restrictions on the namespace because of their concerns. And there's a legitimate debate about it. Is that the most efficient way to protect their legitimate interests, or are there other ways you could do it? So what we don't want, I think, and this is a good place to conclude, the internet is a fundamental transformative technology that has had enormous public benefit for the world, right? It is an essential public good, not in the economic sense, but or not necessarily in the economic sense of public good, but a public resource that is critical to our economies, our cultures, our societies, everything. We don't want to see the core of the net becoming a realm of contestation, control games, efforts to impose new kinds of perversions onto the technical architecture of the net in order to serve purposes that it was not intended to serve. That's the concern. When you look at something like even like the WHOIS system that we use for keeping track of registrations and so on, it was not intended to be a law enforcement or intellectual property protection mechanism. Okay? And now as we look to the next generation of registry services, directory services, again, same questions come up. Do we want to configure the architecture as a tool to serve these other purposes, or do we want to pursue those through other less interventionist mechanisms which will leave the net in a cleaner state? I tend towards the latter view. Okay, we were a little bit pressed for time. I'm very sorry we didn't get to take more questions, but I'm around and I'm happy to chat with anybody. Have a look at the paper if you want. There's also a video, and I'm happy to interact electronically and so on with anybody in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. Very interesting. Tenemos un panel más. 5 minutos de café.